One more question. The chat's only open to us, right? Or is it open to everyone?
Just us.
Okay.
There's a last minute change. I don't know if you can do this quickly. If you,
What do you got, Rob?
my last two slides are out of order. You can flip flop them. Appreciate it.
So let's see. I'll say them out loud. So you have a picture of the building. Then the next one is like the staircase openings.
Right. You need to flip the reverse it.
Do the staircase openings first.
Yeah, and then the building last.
Building last.
That's it. That's it. That's the time.
Are those the only changes?
Yep. Sure.
Building last. Got it. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's panel discussion on mass timber. Thank you so much for joining us today, whether you are up north, down south, out east, out west, or overseas. Thank you for joining us. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We're very much looking forward to this discussion today. My name is Lisa Hickerson. I am the Business Development Manager for Turner, New York. So today we have a phenomenal panel. We are going to go through about 15 minutes of case studies on two very exciting projects. And then we're going to get into our joint discussion with our panel members. There is a Q&A feature at the bottom. I'm sure everybody is familiar with Zoom at this point. Please feel free to type in your questions. If we don't get to them, because we have so much wonderful content, we absolutely will do our best to follow up. We will be recording the session. It will be sent out after the webcast. We also are sharing some material and presentation, so you will be getting that after the fact as well. So with that being said, I want to make sure we get straight to it because we have a lot of great information. I'd like to welcome John Peranto from Thornton Tomasetti. He's a senior principal and our Chicago co-office director. He's going to take us through today the Ascent Tower project in Milwaukee. This is a very exciting project, and we're really happy to have TT as part of our panel, and they also were gracious enough to help us co-host this panel. So with that, John, take it away.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Lisa. So our Ascent project, which we'll talk a little bit about today, is in Milwaukee. It's a 25-story mass timber building by the lakefront, and it sits on top of a post-tension parking garage. This gives you a little bit of an overview where it's situated, relative to the water, pretty close to the exposure of open water. So, in general, it's a pretty unique, challenging project from a structural perspective. Next. So this gives you the floor plates for the building. Really, it's really a tale of two buildings. One, efficient parking, below. All the parking is above grade, nothing's below grade, which is common in Milwaukee. And then also the mass timber frame floor plates above, which you can see are all residential here in this overview. And putting those two together, not only just from a unit layout standpoint, from a structural perspective, but also marrying up the two systems between concrete and mass timber was one of the greater challenges of the project. Next. So to give you an idea, there are a lot of players. This project's success is predicated upon, really a strong team. The one thing that this project had was good collaboration from day one, from our developer who's on the line, who will be talking a little bit today as well, to my partners at Corb Architects in Milwaukee, to our contractors, CD Smith and Swinnerton, all really made this project possible through good collaboration. Next. So I would say the nuts and bolts of Ascent is really that this project needed to push beyond what was permitted in the code. And, to spend just a little bit of time in this overview presentation is we utilized basically the provisions in IBC for performance-based design and alternate materials through testing as the means to actually provide structural performance that is equal to or better than type 1 construction. Next. I would say this just gives you a little overview. Wisconsin's a little bit modified from IBC, but in general, the IBC 2015 framework was the path. And as you can see, we basically utilized type 4 construction and pushed our variants through under that category. Next. And this was really the crux of the variance, really just increasing the height and a host of other details non-related to structure as well. But in general, I'm going to talk a little bit about the fire performance requirements that we utilized on this project in order to get our variance. So next. Perfect. So yeah, so this is our 3-hour column fire test. We did this at the Forest Products Laboratory. This was the first 3-hour column fire test. We used this to justify the mass timber column frame on the project. Next. And really the other pieces of the project were done to almost what is permitted in the code. So the provisions for 2-hour fire rating was done through CHAR, and that's published in the NDS, and that is already currently permitted. The columns we talked about, the 3-hour fire test. And then for the CLT panels on the project, that was done through performance specification of actually providing a 2-hour certified fire test for the panels that are used on the project. Next. And this is really the buildup of the project. One of the unique things to mention here is that we took the concrete cores all the way to the top. There was a host of reasons we did this. One, for creating a hardened corridor that could be accessed during construction, but also really just to get the concrete out of the way as far as freeing up crane time for the timber erection. But really, it's comprised of a glulam timber frame and then CLT panels. Next. And this is the typical floor plate for the project. So typical floor plate, maximum spans 20 feet or less for the CLT, about 25 to 30 feet for a typical glulam beam. And then, some recesses for balconies, but those were all done outside of the timber and were done outside of the actual building envelope. Next. And this really, I think, is the best opportunity to get a quick shot of how the building was comprised. We utilized high strength piles. It was part of the sustainability narrative. We wanted to double the capacities of the piles that are in Milwaukee. We did that. And then we pushed a very efficient post-tension structure up through the parking, transferred it out in order to maximize the efficiency of the timber frame. And then from that point forward, pushed forward with the mass timber frame. Now this video doesn't quite show it, but the concrete cores were designed to be freestanding all the way up prior to any timber being in place. And then really, we're about a 1-week floor cycle for the project in order to really complete each floor. But yeah, next. But that gives you a quick overview of Ascent. and looking forward to talking a little bit more in this panel on any topics you're interested in.
Thanks, John. And now next we move down to Nashville. Our Music Row project is going to be presented today by Rob Binford, our Senior Project Manager for Turner. So all yours, Rob.
Great, so thank you. Yeah, so we have a 5-level mass timber structure. It's a Class A office, core and shell project. It's built above a post-tension subterranean garage. This is the first Class A mass timber office space in this region. The architect was Tuck Hinton, the developers Panattoni, and Structurecraft was the timber structural engineer, but they're also the vendor, the manufacturer, and the erector. So kind of a turnkey relationship. Next page. I think our project is not much different than in concept, maybe than the John's, in the sense we have a structural steel core in lieu of concrete. Part of that, though, was that this project originally started out as 100% timber with no structural steel, but we were challenged by the code concerns for concealed spaces and how that would be interpreted by code officials, and would we have to sprinkler those attic spaces or not. So we elected to use structural steel in the core. That eliminated most of those concealed spaces concerns. Next page. The only other element that's really unique, I believe, certainly for Turner projects, is using CLT for the elevator shafts. Obviously, this was done as an aesthetic decision by the architect, but it meets all the requirements for a shaft wall or hoistway. But we knew that this would be a challenge, because essentially a code official is going to come out and say you have an elevator in a wood box, and even though it may technically meet all the requirements for code, we anticipated we would be challenged there. Unfortunately, in Nashville, most of our code officials are actually really well educated on mass timber, and so we really didn't have a problem other than getting the state elevator inspector aligned, and ultimately we came to a compromise and had to coat the inside of the hoistway with the intermescent paint. If you go to the next slide. Other than that, this project just flies up, right? It took us 3 months to erect 5 levels, 25,000 feet per floor. We were in a residential neighborhood. If you go to the next slide, please. And in that case, noise was a major sensitivity to our neighbors, and we were, the beauty of timber is that it's a fairly quiet operation. It goes up quickly, and obviously it's beautiful to look at. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Rob. All right, so now we're going to move into the panel discussion. But first, I wanted to welcome our moderator to the stage here, Joe Militia. He's part of our Turner Engineering Group, and also he has become Turner's national mass timber expert. He's been leading the charge from the Turner side on this front. So before we jump into the panel discussion, just wanted to give Joe a few minutes just to kind of go through industry growth and just a high-level overview of where mass timber is nationally.
Thank you, Lisa. And I want to thank Rob and John for 2 great presentations that really demonstrate the multiple uses of mass timber on various building occupancies. The mass timber construction has always been a desirable building product due to its highly sustainable value, biophilic benefits, and natural architectural beauty. But until recently, it was primarily used for the construction of smaller buildings and residential structures. However, the mass timber market is changing rapidly and is poised for an exponential growth, as one of the major impediments to its being used is being removed in many markets with the introduction and adoption of the 2021 International Building Code. These code changes, which have established 3 new construction types for mass timber, where there were previously only 1, now allow for mass timber buildings to be built up to 18 stories and to a square footage of up to 324,000 square foot for business occupancies. These changes are shifting the paradigm of mass timber building owners from what was traditionally college and universities, public municipalities, and smaller hotel and residential developers to those owners that have a need to construct larger buildings that are also aligned with their overall sustainability mission and desire to create healthier environments for their employees and tenants. The result is more and more developers and corporate clients are asking, can my building be built in mass timber? Today, I'm happy to tell clients in many markets that this could be a reality. And today we've assembled a panel to further that discussion.
Thanks, Joe. All right, so let's welcome our panelists. I'd like to re-welcome John to the panel discussion. And then we have Tim Gockman from Newland Enterprises, who's the managing director of Newlands, and he's leading the Ascent Tower project. And then Momo Sun from Woodworks. She is a regional project manager. And Woodworks, just so everybody knows, has been really a go-to resource for commercial and multifamily wood building design, engineering, and construction. And they're really here as a support for free one-on-one project assistance containing education and design tools and on-demand resources. So for the next 30 minutes, hopefully you enjoy the discussion. Joe, stage is yours.
Okay, and I'm going to direct these questions to an individual, and then feel free to chime in if somebody wants to add at all. And I'm going to start by picking on our owner, developer, Tim. We have a varied audience in terms of geographic locations and business lines. We saw in the presentation that some areas have embraced mass timber more heavily than others. What were the reasons you chose to do the Ascent project in mass timber? And what do you feel are the benefits that drive other project teams to make that same decision?
So the primary driver initially for us was aesthetics. Ascent is about 50% exposed. And so we really wanted to leverage that to create a unique product, a differentiated product. That's what it started with. And I still think that that's one of the, that's going to be a leading driver for us to continue to choose mass timber. But what we have learned over the last couple of years is that it's also faster, it's more precise, it's lighter, it's quieter, as was said before. And then, of course, there's the sustainability aspect of it. And so, because I mean, there are challenges, as there are with any innovative product technology, but in the grand scheme of things, we see mass timber as a category killer. There really are no compromises in switching from mass timber. There are few compromises in switching from mass timber to from concrete or steel.
Go ahead. Do you want to add, Rob? Or Momo?
No.
Okay.
I think Tim really got it all there. I have
Yeah.
a couple of good points for why usually people choose to go with mass timber, but I think that that's really all up there. Sustainability, aesthetics is a huge one. And then a little bit, since my background is in structural engineering, a lot of times when I'm helping structural engineers, we find that the mass timber is so light that you really do save on foundation. Either you're saving on foundation or you're able to build more in poor soils. So that's one of the reasons that we don't hear about as much.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that too. And Momo, you hit it right on the head for Ascent. It's a pretty challenging site as far as soil conditions, and really Ascent is a third of the weight of a typical PT building of its scale, floor by floor. It's on the net for a project with its PT, it's about 50% of the weight, so half the foundations, half of the load. But in addition to that, half of the length of pile, which is 100 feet, that's driven in Milwaukee. So it was significant savings in the foundation as well as construction time.
Okay. And then our second question, and I'm going to pick on you again, Tim, because the owners are the ones that get these projects going. We saw it in the presentation that the largest sectors of mass timber is being used in commercial and multifamily. Why do you think that is, and what do you think are other opportunities?
Why do I think that is? Again, from our personal experience and what we're hearing on the office side, the driver's aesthetics. So in commercial and multifamily, that makes them more sense. I think that it translates to hospitality really well too. So I think we'll see it being used in hotels. Could it translate to other industrial uses or hospitals? Maybe, but really our focus is, how do we get mass timber mainstream? How do we get as many people using it as possible? And multifamily and office and hotel seem to be the easiest to understand. On top of that, we've been saying that, look, if we can do it on ascent with an irregular floor plate at that height, then you should be able to do it anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I want to also clarify and point out that when you started the Ascend project was before the building codes had actually been adopted for the larger buildings. Is that accurate?
Yeah, Milwaukee was using 2015 IBC. So no matter what, Ascend was going to have to go the alternative means and methods route.
Yeah. So hopefully with the change in the code, it'll make it even easier. And we thank you for being a pioneer in this. John, it's a follow-up. Some people may be a little apprehensive about doing a full timber building. So are there any options that you have to maybe not have to be full timber and, to introduce mass timber in a project?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to that is yes. I mean, even Ascent in itself is a composite structure. We did what we thought was right for the project, not necessarily what was, the forced solution. The concrete cores themselves made a lot of sense from our discussions with the fire department, as well as having a means to actually safely egress a building in case of an incident during construction. Charge a dry stack in the actual cores themselves during construction. But it also, when you think about the logistical aspects to building a project of Ascent size, 25 stories, it's all about time, scale, and repetition. Having the ability to get that piece of the equation out of the way quickly by carrying the cores up made a lot of sense, and freeing up the crane time for purely the mass timber erection as soon as possible. So to answer the question specifically about other material types being mixed in, I think, yes, I think that is the future. I think you're going to see that in markets where you need to go taller to make your building actually pencil out for the value of the site. Wood has a finite strength value for vertical load carrying capacity. There will be a point where you're going to need to start looking at other means to support the weight vertically. If you start going beyond 25 stories, then you start getting up to the 50, 60 story buildings. That's where hybrids will really take over. But also to add to like what Tim was mentioning, those other types of building topologies like hospitals, labs, others, there are other opportunities to intermix sustainable materials, whether it's steel or concrete or hybrid mix between the two. There are options. And I think you should think that way when deciding about timber.
Well, look, the new Portland terminal is being built out of mass timber. So,
yep.
Mm-hmm. As a follow-up to that question, considering we're virtually in New York, and I know Momo is in New York, so this question is for you. And I know a lot of people are going to be close to their screen to listen to this answer. Will this work in New York City? And what do you think the initial challenges may be that you would anticipate?
Yeah, absolutely. So with Woodworks, we basically field calls and emails from people that are experienced and also people who's really never heard of mass timber. And I get the question about New York City a lot. Can we even use mass timber in New York City? The answer is absolutely. So as of now, you can build 6 to 7 stories in New York City using mass timber. It's up to 85 feet. So we haven't adopted any of the tall mass timber yet. Not to say that you can't do it, as we've already heard that Tim got a variance and that's how Ascent was built. So definitely welcome pioneers on this side of the country as well. There are already projects in New York City that are mass timber. I think people are also surprised to hear that. There are a couple, at least 3 or 4 that we know about in New York City that are completed or are just finishing up interiors right now. And those are, for the most part, multifamily, for the most part in Brooklyn. There are also, I think 1 or 2 sort of mass timber that are additions. So just adding a level, adding a mezzanine, something like that. But definitely so much interest in New York City for mass timber that I get called and asked about it all the time. And I think it's really well suited for New York City as well. I think we touched on some of these points about construction being fast and in the city, I think, time is money. You want to get your building done and rent it out. So definitely can use it in New York City.
Mhm.
Yeah, I
Right.
think too, just to add on to that too, Joe, I think New York is also a good example of how a hybrid system would really, I think, provide a lot of value. And finding that means to provide equivalency for taller buildings, in like a place like Manhattan, where a 25-story building would be rare because you're not building enough square footage on the site. I think that would be a good instance to actually start looking at hybrid systems if timber was in the mix and finding the sweet spot, in terms of how much of the structure is actually the timber and what actually is not. One thing, Momo, that you mentioned too, that we didn't talk about on Ascent, but even though it's in Milwaukee, we have a very constrained site. So every basic piece of mass timber was taken straight off the flatbed and immediately craned onto the deck. There's no staging yard. It was literally pulled up right next to the site and unloaded and then put in place. So systems like that offer a lot of flexibility too for tight constrained sites and being able to take advantage of small spaces.
Yeah, that's exactly how these Brooklyn projects were done. The trucks are double parked on the streets and there's no staging area. It's gone right into the building. And one other thing that I forgot to mention is, I just wanted to talk about CLT in New York City for a little bit. So up until now or before, CLT was not allowed in New York City, which is sort of the hot New York product. But the new New York City building code has already accepted CLT as a building material, and this code really comes into effect, we expect sometime this year, or October, November is sort of what we're hearing. So if you are looking to build in New York City, it's not a problem to use CLT. It's coming.
And that should really help the growth of the market, because CLT is probably the mass timber that's used the most, correct?
Yeah, the other ones, like the ones in Brooklyn, are either NLT or GLT, the laminated version. They're a one-way span instead of spanning 2 directions like CLT. That's really the only difference, but they're really great for decking, for floors and roofs.
Mm-hmm. Okay, jumping back to the Ascent project, we saw the overview of it, and things are really successful to this point. So, Tim, what do you think is making that a success?
Well, from the beginning, I think the biggest ingredient was building this team, and I think that it can't be overstated how critical it is to build a knowledgeable team. So for us, bringing Thornton Tomasetti was logical. They already had experience building Brock Commons, understood both the market and the building technology. But the joint venture of general contractors on this project didn't have experience with mass timber, at least not with tall timber. And so that's where bringing Timber Lab in was so critical, as well as bringing in a fire safety and a engineer and a building envelope consultant that understood mass timber really well, era. And when, again, going back to how do you deal with innovation, because innovation always brings about ambiguity and a leap of faith that a lot of people are not comfortable with. And the answer is you have to eliminate as many things as you can with existing knowledge. So to the end that you can bring partners, whether it's a joint venture or whether it's somebody that you can hire onto the team that has already had that specific experience and you don't have to figure it out, that's really, really valuable. And so whether that's a developer or whether that's a structural engineer or a general contractor, et cetera, building the right team is really, really critical up front and getting everybody involved up front, because on a project this size, there's, everything is designed digitally, right? We're going through the BIM process and our wood came from Austria. So, those drawings better be really accurate. And they were, right? And so that was a big component of success. The other thing is, from a code perspective, we approached the city right away. The city, the fire department got involved early on. And so if we didn't have that go ahead, obviously this panel would be occurring with me on it. And so, right, getting people involved, getting experts involved, getting people involved early, getting everybody involved early, really key points.
Yeah, and if I could add on to that just a little bit from the success of Ascent, I think too, one of the key steps on the project was involving our mass timber contractor early, and really getting a sense of how you wanted to actually construct the building, how you wanted to procure the building, understanding the limitations of certain regional facilities, understanding, the small things to a designer, or the details that a designer might imply on their documents that could severely limit procurement options or severely hinder on constructability selection. So I think engaging early your contractor is key for something that's so modular, so based on how you want to build it. That was a major success with our partners on Ascent.
And I'll add, John, too, the role of the general contractor and the engineer, I think, are well understood. I think people don't fully appreciate the role of the developer and what it's supposed to be. And that is supposed to be subject matter expertise. So, for example, Newland is an expert in multifamily. That is something we don't have to figure out, right? So John already knows that when we come to them with a building, we know the concept inside and out. We know exactly how we want that floor plate to be designed. We aren't tweaking it later on. And so every member of the team should be the subject matter expert.
Now, Momo, I know Woodworks was the integral part of the Ascent project and early on in the design as well as through construction, and you're a valuable resource to others. And I encourage you all to reach out to Woodworks in your markets. But how are you capturing, being that Tim pointed out, this is kind of a pioneering project here. How are you collecting those lessons learned and sharing that with the rest of the industry?
Yeah, so we have basically regional directors like myself throughout the country. So I'm in New York City and I cover New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. So basically each of us will be the hub of information for our areas. But as a team nationwide, we continue to gather these lessons learned, and we continue to gather questions and issues that come up for every design team. And we have a lot of resources on our website. Can't urge you guys enough to poke around on there. We have a section we have these expert tips, which is almost like an FAQ sort of thing, questions that come up a lot, whether it's code related or design or construction related. We have sort of more a back-end experts team that will do write-ups, really detailed write-ups for them. We also have case studies and seminars, like we had a webinar on Ascent with Tim earlier, which is also a recording that people can watch, as well as white papers that we develop from lessons learned and things that we basically push forward. Other things that we basically try to tackle that comes out of the industry, for example, the labor force. We are tackling or we're developing training programs to train the laborers to build with mass timber. So across the country, we've partnered with a number of carpenters unions that will basically provide training locally throughout the year or the years to come. Another initiative that we have done is also with insurance. All these things you don't think about as much. That's outside of just the design team. So education and white papers for insurance companies to make sure that they don't just, that they understand the risk properly and don't just bring the, blow the price out of the waters when you're asking to insure mass timber.
Yeah, and I can add to that. So insurance was a big pain point for us, and it gets much worse with tall timber than, let's say, mass timber below 84 feet or whatever it is. Additionally, the John 14 fire tests that we did, that data is publicly available, and I don't know if the USDA has published it yet, but if you can't find it on USDA or through Woodworks, you can contact us and we'll point you in the right direction. But those tests are done. There shouldn't be a need to repeat them.
Yeah, appreciate you sharing. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great thing to mention, Tim. One of the goals of the project too is to help further advance the industry. We had great support from Woodworks. We had great support from other entities to help fund some of these tests as well. And, through the Forest Products Laboratory, all that data is publicly available. I think they just published the paper on the 3-hour column fire test recently. So that data is now available. So yeah, hopefully the data keeps continuing to gather and all of it becomes public. I think that it's always a shame when such good data is available, but it's not public. So, we made sure that wasn't the case on Ascent.
Yeah, that's a very good point on the fire rating. Everybody likes to witness a fire rating once in their lifetime test, but they don't want their job to be dependent on it passing for it to go forward in the time that's involved. So I appreciate sharing that component. While we're on Ascent, there's probably some questions in the Zoom call here about where the product came from, and I'm sure there was a little bit of eyebrows raised when you mentioned that it was from Austria for the Ascent project. So, what drove you to buy your material internationally, Tim?
Well, at the time, first of all, the supply chain in North America wasn't as robust, but really we relied on our mass timber contractor, Timber Lab, for that selection. And generally the decision was driven by experience, cost. It ended up being less expensive to put the European white spruce on a container, ship it to the Eastern Seaboard, via train to Chicago, and then via truck to Milwaukee. I think that'll change. The supply chain continues to improve in North America, and so we hope to be able to source it locally. But given the volume of timber at Ascent, we really needed the experience and the reliability of that supply chain. So that was why we decided to go with KLH. But we already see the improvements in North America with the opening of new plants.
I think Ascent 2 will be a catalyst, for North America to have more confidence in projects of this scale for mass timber. one of the major issues we had with the supply chain in North America was, taking our project seriously at the beginning, and procurement for entities that are smaller than some of the ones in Europe from a supply chain standpoint make it very risky for them to, dedicate so much of their production to one large project. And I think that played into it a little bit. I think there is something to be said though, too, because when we actually went to Europe, they own all the way down to the forest. So they control their supply chain very differently than here in North America, as far as how they, develop their products. And one of the things too that I think was an eye opener for all of us was the actual evaluation of transportation embodied carbon. Shockingly, is actually very efficient coming via boat on a large boat compared to either diesel trucking or diesel training across North America. Where the Milwaukee site is very unique in the fact that most of the transportation was done via ship, which had a dramatic effect on how we looked at that component of the project.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Going forward, John, do you see an advantage to going international versus local, or do you see that maybe changing with capabilities in the future as we do larger buildings?
It's changing massively. I mean, the makeup of mass timber in North America, just since we started Ascent, is totally different. I think North America is going to become I hope, a powerhouse in producing this type of product on a large scale. You're going to see a lot more competition, but I'm always a promoter of engaging competitive bidding. I think it sparks innovation. So I think that process should never be heavily reliant on one particular source. Every source is different. Their manufacturing capabilities can be different. You need to think about that when you're designing these mass timber buildings so that you can still access production, North America, Europe, and all throughout.
Thank you. And Tim, I got a question here for the developers out there, and I know they ask me this question all the time. As a developer, we understand it's important to have projects that produce a return on investment. So without disclosing too many trade secrets, can you comment on whether the market is willing to pay more for mass timber buildings in terms of rent or resale value?
Yeah, very common question. So when we started the project, I was fortunate enough to receive the advice to not build any premiums in to the pro forma, which we did not. And I think that the power of mass timber is that it does perform economically and from a constructability standpoint against concrete and steel. The challenges in engineering, it's not whether you can design a building in mass timber, it's if you can do it economically. For us, I think John referenced this earlier, the challenge is to really know precisely. You have to design a building both ways, right? Let's say in PT and in mass timber and price it out to know exactly. You're not going to do that. So you have to have, again, a team knowledgeable enough to ballpark what it would have cost in the traditional material and compare against that. The challenge, as I understand it, and the Turner team can answer this better than I can, is that the price of concrete, right? We're multifamily, so we really think in terms of PT versus mass timber. The price of PT varies significantly from market to market. It might be in the mid-upper 30s in Milwaukee, it might be in the 50s in Cleveland, and God knows what in New York. Whereas the cost of mass timber is going to be relatively consistent. So number one, there's that comparison. But going back to that, if it can be done in Milwaukee by us, it should be able to be done anywhere. Milwaukee is a relatively affordable market for PT, and we believe that Ascent comes out roughly par. Now, the counterpoint is, right, people will point to the T3 that Hines did in Minneapolis, and they got a significant premium on the cap rate on the exit versus what you would expect a typical building to sell for in Minneapolis. Yes, first of all, that's a data point. That's not good enough for appraisers and investors to say, well, there it is, settled. Number one. Number two, it's difficult to extrapolate how much of that cap compression was due to mass timber and how much of it was due to Amazon as a tenant. And did Amazon choose the building because it was mass timber, or was it just serendipity? And if they did choose it for mass timber, how much of the cap rate compression do you ascribe to mass timber, and how much do you ascribe to Amazon? So it's not exactly clear. My advice is that frankly, my belief is that the performance should work on its own. And any cap rate compression or rent premium should be icing on the cake if you can get it. But isn't the point of mass timber to replace concrete where it makes sense, or to replace steel where it makes sense without a price premium, to have it be cost competitive, right? So yes, can you get premiums? Maybe. The answer is maybe. But I would also challenge, and this is really for the developer, right, to think broader about this question. It's not just the rent. It's not just the cap rate on the exit, if there is an exit, that can drive premiums. It's also faster absorption, lower turnover, higher occupancy. Those things are also valuable. And so if you have a differentiated product with biophilic benefits, that should make the case.
Yes, great point. There's more to value than just dollars. And I'm going to wrap this up with a final question for each of you. And since I came at Tim so hard here, we'll give him a chance to breathe and let him finish last. But I'm going to start in, you have 45 seconds or so. Let's keep it under a minute to really your final thoughts on mass timber, whether that's current or future or both. And I'll start with you, John.
Yeah, I think it's exciting to see where it's going. You know, as the industry grows and you get new players in the market, I think people are going to try to innovate. You know, I think right now we have a supply chain that's glulam beams and CLT and some other products that are similar. But I think finding those new systems and that is going to be the exciting piece to mass timber. You know, even just how you grow wood, creating genetically modified wood, you know, that's either faster growth or higher strength. Some of that stuff we don't talk about at all, but has a major impact on sizing, floor to floor heights, everything that can drive change that could be a differentiator. So I think the material technology and new players and new innovation is, I think, what I'm most excited about.
And Momo?
Yeah, for lightning round. Definitely looking forward to seeing more mass timber, and I know it's coming because looking at the map that you showed earlier, that was looking at the number of mass timber buildings already built versus the number that I know are in development and in design. There is a huge difference. Are so many that are going to pop up in the next couple of years. And I think it's also driven sustainability driven and lowering carbon footprint, which is something that US as a nation is looking to do, and certain states have their own goals for infrastructure, things like that. So I think all of that is really going to help drive this movement towards mass timber, and looking forward to the wood industry to continue to move forward as more design teams get on board and feel comfortable designing with mass timber, and the supply chain is right there to follow, and looking forward to more manufacturers popping up, hopefully on the East Coast.
Yeah, I hope you get very busy in New York, Momo, going forward.
Yeah.
And Tim, I'll let you wrap it up.
So we see mass timber as the Tesla equivalent for the construction industry. Tesla was a category killer because it wasn't an argument for what you should do. It was a product that you would want to do. And mass timber is the same, right? Better in pretty much every respect. And what's awesome to see is that we know that this isn't a niche movement because it is being embraced by so many different industries, so many different owners. The new Walmart headquarters is being built entirely out of mass timber. I think it's something like 1.1 million square feet. We've consulted Google, we've consulted Lend-Lease. There's so many different players looking at this. So we know that it's a broad movement. And I can tell you from personal experience, this 25-story building that we built, it's not our last one. We are so pleased with how this is turning out that we are looking to build additional ascents throughout the country. So yes, absolutely, it's coming.
Okay, well, that's going to wrap up our panel discussion. I think Lisa's been monitoring the Q&A here, so I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Awesome. We have so many questions. I tried to categorize them so we could do this a little bit more strategically. I think you guys hit a lot. This is a great discussion. I learned a lot during this panel. The one question that came up that I thought was pretty interesting, one was we're seeing a lot of GCs going to prefab as much as possible. So curious, was Ascent done as heavy timber on the site? And if one wanted to do pieces offsite to save on the cost estimate, is that possible? So maybe John, if you want to take that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ascent was a very prefabricated structure when you think about it. The challenge was marrying the prefabricated structure with the work on site. So I think that was, the challenge that we had from a tolerance standpoint. But in general, I think that is one of the great benefits of it. So if you try to do a lot of mass timber work on site, I think then the system concept bogs down. Yeah. So I mean, I think that's one of the main points too to think about moving forward is the devil's in the details. So we talked a little bit during our panel discussion. I probably should have mentioned it there, but the construction industry is going to, I think become more knowledgeable on how to do these mass timber buildings well, far before the entire design industry does. And as mass timber becomes prevalent, I think that's an important thing to know, that there's a large gap in terms of how to do these projects well from a design standpoint, that are going to really make or break the success of the project as far as cost, as far as constructability, knowing where your partnerships are, the procurement process. It's like steel, but there's no steel fabricators, engineer. So design responsibilities live differently, knowing who should do what, how far. It's different in mass timber from a design standpoint than any other material that we design for. So it's a great question.
And I would say it's not just different, it's better, right? So we were forced to, we designed Ascent down to the light switch. That was the level of detail. And so all of those vertical penetrations for MEPs, those CLT slabs are coming with those already in place. There's no coring on site. Out of the hundreds of vertical penetrations we have per floor, I think the plumber missed a couple. That was it. But the benefit to that is it's so much faster on site. You're not spending time on site in an uncontrolled environment. I mean, the size of the crew that erected the frame was a quarter of what we would typically see with a 17,000 square foot floor plate in PT. So yes, you spend more time up front. You have to spend more time up front, but the payback on site is huge.
Just going on that, because there were a couple questions. I didn't mean to cut you off, Rob. There were actually a couple questions about the sequencing and just schedule differences between mass timber and a typical system. Are there any unique differences with a mass timber sequence? And one of the questions particularly came up about Ascent and the concrete core, and if the core was erected prior to the wood frame, or was that being constructed level by level with the wood structure?
Yeah, so that was definitely led, or I should say it definitely led the actual sequencing. That was one of the intentional goals of the project for a couple of reasons, but the biggest reason was you talked about having.
You can see it behind me.
Yeah, no, that's right. And they were designed to be full freestanding, almost like you would see in the UK where you have slip form buildings where the core goes the entire way before even some of the floors get constructed. So that was a unique aspect, mostly driven by freeing up the crane.
Rob, I cut you off. Did you have something to add?
Well, I was just going to speak to the labor component that Tim mentioned, is just how skilled labor is in such short supply, and labor costs are so much higher today than they were a year or 5 years ago. That continues to be a challenge in the delivery of all these structures, right? But timber, on the other hand, as Tim pointed out, it is maybe 1/4 as many erectors are needed as compared to if you're doing a post-tension deck that requires 30 to 40 skilled laborers on that deck placed in concrete. So thinking about operationally and how these buildings go into place and where labor is today, that's one of the neat things about timber and the delivery method.
Great. Switching to sustainability quick, obviously there's questions about how the wood is harvested, and for LEED, you have to be within a certain radius for the project location to get points. Momo, I know we've spoken about this on some of our prep calls. If you have any insight on just the harvesting component and the sustainability aspect.
Right. I do get asked this question a lot because people that want to use mass timber definitely are sustainability driven. And for LEED, they ask about the 500 miles radius, or where is this harvested? So it's sort of an unfair comparison for mass timber. It's not really apples to apples in terms of mass timber or concrete and steel, because when we talk about mass timber, the distance people talk about is where the tree is grown, where the forest is, where it's harvested. That's where the manufacturer is, which may be, from the west side or the south side, if which might be further if you're on the East Coast. But when you're talking about concrete or steel, you might have a supplier that's less than 500 miles away, and you think that you're doing really well for transportation, but it's not necessarily made there. It's most of the time not made there. So where did it come from before that? And that part of the transportation is sort of discounted or not counted, whereas mass timber, you're counting all the way from where the tree is coming from. And in terms of sustainability of the forests themselves, they are all well maintained. I think Tim had mentioned in one of our previous calls, which makes a really good point, is that a lot or most of the US forests are privately owned. So if you want to have more trees in this country, you should actually use more lumber, which sounds like not intuitive, but we need to help the lumber market move. So the more lumber that you buy, the more trees that we use, the more that we keep these forests in business. Because if you owned a forest and nobody wanted to buy your lumber, you're going to sell that land and make it a farm. You're going to sell it to agriculture, which is actually one of the biggest competitors for forestry.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that. The amount of timber used at a cent is replaced through natural growth, not replanting even, just natural growth in North American forests in about 23 minutes. So we've got plenty of forest capacity. And again, remember, this isn't like the old heavy timber buildings where you're using old growth forest. You're using younger growth forests, and as most natural things that are younger grow faster. So we're increasing the speed at which the carbon is captured by using younger growth forests. There are just so many benefits. And so, no, there isn't a conflict between sustainability, environmentalism, and using mass timber, quite to the contrary.
On that note too, with embodied carbon, Tim, when you did the analysis, did you look into the embodied carbon savings? And obviously the reduction in carbon capture from the trees, balances out with the usage of steel or some other product, concrete. Do you have any insight on that?
Oh yeah, and look, I mean, Ascent is a mass timber hybrid. I don't think anyone's figured out how to do foundations within concrete. So we're not talking about wholesale replacement, but yes, where we can substitute it, it's significantly better because mass timber is a carbon sink, pure and simple. So yes, we did an analysis up front, and I think that somebody made it more digestible. It was equivalent to taking 2,400 cars off the road for a year. That was the savings in embodied carbon using mass timber versus, let's say, PT. But then on top of it, we're also working on a life cycle analysis. So we'll have better data, and that'll be shared with Woodworks.
Great. Is there anything to take into consideration on the design side using mass timber in a new building, different than a conventional stick built, added sprinklers, obviously the fire rating concerns? John, do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's very different than stick in some ways because stick frame construction from a fire perspective is very different. It's the analogy of big logs versus kindling. I would say as far as design, there are pretty significant differences too. between designing with dimensional lumber versus designing with manufactured products, which I think is the biggest item. Yeah, in general, I would say that there's really no comparison. It's more towards prefabricated construction when you think about mass timber than it would be to more traditional stick-built, like construction, which is like the analogy everyone always used to use for even steel. So, I mean, just in general, I would say it's very different.
I think just to add on that a little bit, because I get this question a lot and I saw a lot in the question and answer. You do have to pay special attention to concealed spaces when it comes to mass timber buildings. Because it's wood and it's concealed, you do have to either fire laminate it with drywall or add sprinklers. So that is something you got to be aware of. It's best left in its natural, beautiful state when you have open space and ceilings, and not to create concealed spaces.
There's about 700 more questions, which we unfortunately don't have time to get to, so we will try and answer as many as possible. Again, thank you all so much. So insightful. I'm sure we could talk for probably another year about this. Excited to see how Ascent and Music Row turn out. So good luck with that. Thank you again for your time. Thank you to TT for pulling this panel together with us. Hopefully everybody enjoyed it. Again, we will be sending out the recording and some of the materials as resources. So hopefully you'll be able to reach out and we'll try and answer as many questions as possible. Our next panel is on the state of the industry. It's at the end of March, so hopefully you could join us again. Thank you all so much. Stay safe and look forward to the future. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, guys.